My mom left me alone at the mall and walked away. The day it all began was just a regular Tuesday evening, one of those calm midweeks when we didn't have any plans and the house was quiet. I remember coming home that night, a little later than usual because I'd stayed behind to catch up on some work. The moment I stepped inside, I could hear her voice from the kitchen, soft and low, just slightly muffled. I paused for a second to listen, curious, and that's when I realized she was whispering, something she never did when she was on the phone with her friends. Usually they'd be talking and laughing, so loud I could hear snippets of their conversations from halfway down the block. This was different. Her voice had a sharper, more hushed quality to it, like she was telling a secret she didn't want overheard. She sounded nervous, maybe even a little flustered, and for reasons I couldn't explain, a strange pang ran through me. I stood there, caught in that awkward space between wanting to announce my arrival and not wanting to break whatever spell she was under. Finally, I made a little noise with my keys, letting her know I was there without actually saying anything. I stepped into the doorway and gave her a quick wave, trying to shake off that unsettling feeling. She glanced up, and the way she looked at me, her whole expression changed in an instant. I couldn't put my finger on it, but her face softened, her voice lowered even more, and she let out a laugh that felt off, like she was forcing it out for my benefit. "Why are you whispering?" I asked, trying to keep my tone lighthearted. I gave her a grin, hoping to dispel whatever tension had crept into the room. "Oh, it's nothing important. Just girl stuff." She gave another laugh, this one brighter. But as she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, her hand trembled just a bit. Her smile, which was usually warm and easy, was strained. It reminded me of the smile people give you when they're holding something back, like when you ask someone how they're doing, and they respond with a quick, "fine," even though you know it's a lie. I didn't push her. I told myself I was being silly, imagining things that weren't there. But still, something about the whole exchange left me with a strange emptiness in my stomach. After that night, I tried to brush off my suspicions. I told myself I was overthinking things. But as the days wore on, the strange, gnawing feeling didn't go away. I couldn't pinpoint it exactly, just little things that seemed to stack up, each one barely noticeable on its own. Yet together, they made me feel like I was living with someone I didn't entirely know. For starters, she became almost obsessive about her phone. She'd always been one of those people who would leave her phone around the house, often letting it buzz with notifications she'd ignore for hours. She'd joke about being old school and claim she didn't need to be glued to a screen all the time. But now, her phone never left her side. If I came near it, she'd pick it up or flip it face down, as though even the sight of her lock screen was something she didn't want me to see. One evening, we were watching a movie on the couch, something we'd done 100 times. I had my arm around her, my fingers tracing light circles on her shoulder as we watched, but she seemed distracted. Every time her phone buzzed, she would tense up, glancing down at it like she was expecting something. Finally, at one point, she got up without a word, phone in hand, and left the room. She didn't return for almost 15 minutes. When she came back, I looked at her, raising my eyebrow. "Everything okay?" She gave me a quick smile, but her eyes darted away from mine. "Yeah, it's just work stuff." She forced a laugh, waving it off. You know how they always seem to need something at the worst times? On a Saturday night? I tried to joke, but there was an edge to my voice that I couldn't quite mask. She shrugged, brushing me off. "I know, right?" Then she turned back to the movie, pulling her legs up and resting her head on my shoulder like everything was fine. But her body felt tense against mine, and as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the sense that she was 1,000 miles away. The following day, I woke up early, hoping to catch her before she left for her girls' brunch she'd told me about. She had the entire day planned out with her friends, or at least that's what she'd said. As I made coffee, I noticed her phone sitting on the counter unlocked. A message was pulled up on the screen, and without meaning to, I caught sight of the name at the top, Dylan. I looked away quickly, feeling guilty, but something inside me twisted. Dylan. I didn't know a Dylan in her circle of friends. I couldn't recall her mentioning him at all, which was unusual because she loved telling me stories about her friends. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the name stuck in my head, lingering like an itch I couldn't scratch. Later that day, as she got ready to leave, I found myself watching her more closely than usual. She was smiling to herself as she packed her bag, humming a tune under her breath. There was a new energy about her, a nervous excitement that I hadn't seen in a while. "Looking forward to brunch?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She looked up surprised, like she hadn't noticed I was there. "Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been forever since we had a girls' day." She laughed, but it sounded just a little too enthusiastic. And once again, I felt that strange, hollow sensation in my chest, the kind of ache that comes from a truth you don't want to see yet can't quite ignore. A week or so went by, but the name Dylan stayed in my mind like an unwanted guest that refused to leave. I tried to push it down, telling myself that not every unfamiliar name was a reason for alarm. Yet, every time her phone chimed with a message, that same unease crept up my spine. Then came the night when I found myself alone in the living room, her phone forgotten on the coffee table while she was upstairs. She had mentioned she was running a bath and would probably be up there for a while. I glanced at the phone, then away, trying to fight the urge. I had always respected her privacy, but now, with that gnawing suspicion tugging at me, I found myself battling an inner conflict I didn't like. After a few minutes of pretending to watch the game, I finally gave in. I picked up her phone, feeling a bit ridiculous and more than a little guilty. I told myself it was just to ease my mind, to finally put this nonsense to rest. I unlocked it, navigating to her messages, my hands clammy and unsteady. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Conversations with her mom, her co-workers, the usual friends. But when I scrolled down, there it was, a chat labeled with a single letter, D. My heart started pounding, and a part of me wanted to put the phone down and pretend I'd seen nothing. But I didn't. The first few messages seemed innocent enough. Inside jokes, some comments on a TV show, and a lot of emojis. But as I scrolled further, I noticed the tone was more intimate. The kind of banter we used to have back when we were dating, filled with little flirtations that once would have made me smile if they'd been between us. And then, there was clear as day. He'd sent her a message about their upcoming trip, talking about how excited he was to finally get some time alone with her. My stomach turned, a sickening wave of realization hitting me harder than I'd expected. I read further. Seeing his mention of plans to make up for lost time, the tone of his messages leaving no doubt about his intentions. I kept scrolling, trying to find anything that might make this look innocent. But then I reached the most recent messages, texts between her and her closest friends. She had told them everything, even about the plans to pass this trip off as a girls' vacation. Not only that, her friends were encouraging it. They'd sent her messages telling her to enjoy herself, saying she deserved to have some fun, even giving her tips on how to keep it all under wraps. My hand shook as I put her phone down, the gravity of what I'd seen sinking in. I leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling, struggling to breathe normally. All the little moments of doubt, all the time she'd brushed off my questions, the forced smiles, it all started to make sense. She was upstairs now, humming to herself, probably thinking about how clever she'd been, how she'd managed to keep everything hidden so easily. But I knew the truth now. I knew the exact depth of her betrayal, and with every passing second, the hollow ache in my chest hardened into something cold and unyielding. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to burst into the bathroom and demand answers. But another part of me knew that if I wanted to end this, I had to do it right. I couldn't just go in with anger. I needed a plan. I took a deep breath, pulling myself together. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make sure there was no way out of this, no way she could twist the truth or dodge responsibility. And by the end of it, she would know just how thoroughly she'd shattered everything we had built together. That night, I barely slept. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling her breathing next to me, steady and peaceful. How was it that she could sleep so soundly, knowing what she was planning? I felt like a stranger in my own life, lying beside someone I thought I knew, feeling the weight of a betrayal I hadn't yet confronted. The next morning, as the first light crept in through the blinds, I watched her get up, stretch, and head to the bathroom with the same ease she always did. Her routine was unchanged, seamless. like she wasn't carrying any secrets at all. She hummed softly as she got ready, tapping her toothbrush against the sink, the sound echoing down the hallway. I stayed in bed, listening, every small detail of her morning routine suddenly magnified and laced with new meaning. When she returned to the bedroom, she leaned over to kiss my forehead, a habit she'd kept since our earliest days together. For a moment, her lips were warm against my skin, familiar and comforting. But as she pulled away, I felt only bitterness. This kiss, one that had once meant something, now felt like a mockery, a hollow act from someone who'd been lying to my face. I stayed silent, watching her as she moved around the room, packing a few last-minute items for her so-called girls' trip. "What are you up to today?" she asked as she zipped up her bag, her tone casual, like it was any other morning. I forced a smile. "Oh, just the usual. Probably catch up on some work. Maybe hit the gym." She nodded, not looking directly at me, her focus entirely on her suitcase. I could tell she was already halfway out the door in her mind, her thoughts miles away with someone else. She checked her phone again, eyes darting to the screen before tucking it back in her pocket. I wondered if it was Dylan messaging her, maybe sending some final sweet words before they'd be alone together. "Sounds good," she said, her voice airy, almost cheerful. "I'll send you a message when we get to the hotel." I almost laughed, but I held it back. The thought of her sending me updates, pretending to be with her friends while she was off with him, it was all a sick joke. Instead, I kept my face neutral. "Yes, sure. Safe travels." She flashed me a quick smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and slung her bag over her shoulder. I walked her to the door, standing there as she slipped on her shoes, adjusting her jacket. She looked up at me, her expression softening as she reached out to brush my cheek with her fingers. I felt the warmth of her touch, a brief reminder of the love we'd once shared. But the feeling was empty now, like the echo of a song you barely remember. "Don't miss me too much," she teased, leaning in for a kiss. I let her kiss me, barely returning it. "I'll try not to," I replied, keeping my voice steady. She chuckled softly, then turned and walked out the door, her steps light and carefree as she headed down the driveway. I watched her pull out of the driveway, waiting until her car disappeared down the street. Only then did I let my shoulders slump, the facade crumbling away as I stood alone in the quiet house. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. It was as if a weight had been lifted, even as the betrayal sat heavy in my chest. I didn't have to pretend anymore. She was gone, and I had a clear path to finally act on everything I'd been holding in. After a few minutes, I went to the closet and pulled out my own packed bag, the one I'd hidden behind the winter coats just in case she happened to notice. Inside were my clothes, my phone charger, my wallet, and the divorce papers I'd quietly prepared, each page waiting for her signature. I checked my watch, making sure I had enough time. Her flight wouldn't take off for another few hours, and I knew where she was headed. I'd memorized her itinerary from a brief moment when she'd left her ticket on the counter, not thinking I'd notice. And now I knew exactly when she'd be at the hotel, with him, blissfully unaware of what was coming. With a steadying breath, I picked up my bag, locked the door, and headed to my car. I had a plane to catch, and I was determined to be there when her vacation truly began. The airport was packed, the noise and bustle almost comforting as I moved through the crowd with a single-minded focus. I didn't let myself think too much. I didn't want to feel anything, not yet. I just needed to get to the gate, board the plane, and follow through with what I knew had to be done. As I stood in line, I thought back to the last time she and I had traveled together. It had been a trip up to the mountains, a cozy little cabin we'd rented just for the two of us. We'd spent our days hiking and our nights by the fire, wrapped up in each other, sharing stories and dreams for the future. I remembered how she'd laughed as we huddled under blankets, and how I'd told myself I was the luckiest guy alive. It all felt distant now, like a memory from someone else's life. When I finally boarded the plane and took my seat, I stared out the window, watching the workers load luggage onto the plane. A couple sat down in the seats beside me, holding hands and whispering to each other, and I had to look away. I focused on my own hands, clasped tightly in my lap, feeling the rough edges of the divorce papers through the fabric of my coat. I felt an odd sense of satisfaction knowing they were with me. The flight was a few hours, but it felt like both an eternity and an instant. I kept running through the plan in my mind, every detail of how I wanted this to go down. I pictured the hotel, the poolside cabanas she'd mentioned in one of her chats with her friends, the little restaurant she'd said was perfect for a getaway. I had it all memorized. Finally, we touched down, and I stepped off the plane into a blast of warm air. The airport was loud, busy, with travelers rushing past me on all sides, but I felt calm, clear-headed almost. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension ease from my shoulders as I made my way through the terminal. I checked into a modest hotel a few blocks from where she and Dylan were staying. I didn't want to risk her running into me if I happened to cross paths with her in the lobby. I needed control over every part of this. I set my bag down, placing the papers carefully on the desk by the window. For a moment, I just stared at them, the finality of it all hitting me in waves. After a quick shower, I changed into fresh clothes, making sure I looked put together. Calm, unaffected, just as I wanted to appear when I confronted her. I didn't want to show anger. I wanted her to see something even more unsettling. A quiet, unbreakable resolve. It was early evening by the time I headed to her hotel. The sun was low, casting a golden glow across the city, and people were out everywhere, laughing, enjoying the warmth, the beauty of a day that seemed perfect. It was the kind of evening she and I might have spent strolling hand in hand, talking about our future. When I arrived at her hotel, I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I spotted the pool area from the lobby, a sprawling terrace filled with lounge chairs and sun umbrellas. I scanned the crowd, and there she was, reclining on a sunbed, wearing sunglasses and a bright sundress, her hair loose, flowing over her shoulders. And right beside her, his hand casually resting on her leg, was Dylan. He was smiling down at her, laughing at something she'd said, his fingers tracing circles on her knee. The sight felt surreal, like watching a scene unfold on a movie screen, but the anger I expected didn't rise up. Instead, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I walked forward, weaving through the crowd, my eyes locked on them. As I got closer, Dylan looked up, his expression shifting from relaxed to confused, then to wary as he realized I was heading straight for them. He straightened up, his hand dropping from her leg as his gaze hardened. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice dripping with annoyance, as if I were the one intruding on his life. I didn't answer him. Instead, I turned to her, holding out the envelope, my gaze steady. "This," I said, my voice calm, controlled. She reached for it, confusion flashing across her face as she took the envelope from my hand. Her eyes flicked to mine, and then to Dylan, who shifted uncomfortably beside her. She opened the envelope, and as she pulled out the papers, her expression changed in an instant. Her face went pale, the color draining as she took in what she was holding. "Alex," her voice was barely a whisper, a mix of shock and fear. I didn't flinch. "It's not what you think?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, my voice laced with sarcasm. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, caught between fear and shame, while Dylan, who was clearly not prepared for any of this, looked between us, helpless and rattled. "Where are your friends?" I asked, my tone sharp, leaving no room for lies. She stammered, clutching the divorce papers as if they might somehow dissolve in her hands. Her face was a mask of shock and panic, and for the first time, I saw her truly without her practiced smiles or careful, calculated words. I waited, watching her struggle to form a sentence, feeling an odd satisfaction in the silence that stretched between us. "Alex," she finally managed, her voice shaking. It's not, please, just let me explain." I shook my head, feeling a hollow sort of disappointment settle over me. "Explain? You lied, right to my face." Repeatedly, I gestured toward Dylan, who looked down, clearly uneasy under the weight of my glare. "And you plan a whole trip with him, pretending it was just a girl's trip. So go ahead, explain that. Explain how this isn't what it looks like." She swallowed, glancing at Dylan as if he might somehow back her up, But he only looked away, scratching the back of his neck. "Look, man," he muttered, his tone low. "Maybe we can all just take a step back here." I didn't even spare him a glance. "You can keep out of this, Dylan," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I'm talking to her." She tried to reach out, her hand trembling as she placed it lightly on my arm. "Alex, I never meant for it to go this far. I don't know, I got lost. Things have been hard, and I needed something. I needed to feel alive again." Her voice cracked, and she pulled her hand back, eyes brimming with tears as she searched my face for any sign of forgiveness. But I couldn't feel sympathy, not now. Not when I'd spent months trying to make sense of her distance, trying to understand why our life together felt hollow, while she had all the answers hidden in her phone. "You needed to feel alive," I repeated, nodding slowly. "And you couldn't talk to me? You couldn't tell me what you were feeling, what you thought was missing. Instead, you decided to lie, to sneak around." I felt my voice start to shake, and I steadied myself. "You made me question myself, question us, and now you're telling me it was just, what, a phase." She bit her lip, looking down, the remorse and guilt clear in her expression. But I didn't want her excuses, her tears. They felt too little, too late. Dylan, still looking uncomfortable, glanced at her, then back at me. "Maybe we should all just go back inside and cool off. There's no reason to make this into some big scene." His voice was strained, his attempt at calm only making him sound condescending. My gaze shifted to him, and I felt a tight anger start to form, a need to set things right, if only for myself. "No, Sina?" I asked, my voice calm as I looked at him, my eyes narrowing. "You don't get to have an opinion here, Dylan. You're just the sidekick tagging along on someone else's broken marriage. So, unless you want to keep digging yourself deeper, maybe just stand back." He opened his mouth as if to protest, but before he could get a word out, I took a step closer, making sure he understood this was not a moment he was welcome in. He looked down, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Turning back to her, I felt that calm, unbreakable resolve settle over me again. "Here's what's going to happen," I said quietly, locking my gaze onto hers. "I'm going to go, and you're going to stay here with him, with everything you chose over us. When you get back, those papers will be waiting, and I won't be there to listen to any more of your excuses." Her face twisted, her eyes wide with desperation. "Alex, please, let's not do this. Let's just talk about it. We can fix this. We've been together so long. Please don't throw it all." "One mistake?" I couldn't help the laugh that escaped, bitter and short. "Is that what you're calling it? This whole charade, the lying, the planning, all for one mistake? No, that's not how this works." I took a breath, feeling a strange, unfamiliar weight lifting, a relief that had been buried under my anger for too long. Dylan, perhaps emboldened by her words, tried one last time to step in. "Maybe you should just leave her alone, man. She's upset." I felt my patience wear thin, and before he could move, I gave him a light shove that caught him off guard, sending him stumbling back. He flailed, trying to catch his balance, but his foot caught on the edge of the sunbed, and he tumbled backward, landing with a loud splash in the pool. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the sounds of splashing as Dylan resurfaced, gasping and sputtering in the water. I looked back at her, unbothered, my voice low and resolute. "I'm done with this. With you?" And without waiting for her response, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there by the pool, clutching those papers, her face pale as she finally realized the truth she'd been running from was right in front of her. I didn't look back. Walking away felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months. I kept my head up, my footsteps steady, even though I could feel her eyes on my back. Part of me almost expected her to call out, to run after me with some last plea, some final, desperate attempt to save face. But the poolside was silent behind me, and with each step, I felt myself growing lighter, as if each inch I put between us loosened a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. When I reached the hotel entrance, I passed by a few curious onlookers who'd witnessed the scene. I felt their stares, but I didn't care. Let them look. Let them wonder. Whatever story they'd pieced together would be nothing compared to the truth of what I'd just lived through. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of my own hotel, sinking back into the seat as the car pulled away from the curb. As we drove, I found myself staring out the window at the passing cityscape, my thoughts a mess of emotions that hadn't fully settled. There was anger, of course, an anger that still sat low in my gut, raw and jagged. But there was something else too, something quieter and harder to pin down. It was a kind of emptiness, a sense of loss that went deeper than the betrayal. We had history, she and I, years of it, each one building on the last like stones in a foundation I thought would hold us forever. We'd built a life together, a future I'd invested everything into. And now, looking back, it was like realizing the foundation had been rotting all along, that every memory, every shared moment had been propped up by lies I'd never seen until now. When I got back to my hotel room, I locked the door behind me and just stood there in the silence, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, older than I had that morning, as if the weight of what I'd uncovered had settled onto my skin, making every line on my face sharper, more defined. I loosened my tie, feeling like it was strangling me, and collapsed onto the edge of the bed. The divorce papers lay on the bedside table where I'd left them, untouched, waiting. I picked them up, flipping through the pages, feeling the weight of each clause, each line of legal text that outlined the end of something I'd thought was unbreakable. I traced the edges of the papers, wondering if she'd actually sign them when she got back. Would she try to talk her way out of it? Or would she finally face what she'd done? A part of me wanted to send her a message, a final word, something that would give me closure. But another part of me knew that any message I sent would only be a reopening of wounds, another chance for her to twist the knife. So I took a deep breath, set my phone on airplane mode, and lay back on the bed, closing my eyes. The silence felt heavy, but for the first time in a while, it was a silence I welcomed. Hours passed, though I barely noticed. It was late when my stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten. I thought about ordering room service, but the idea of staying in that room, with nothing but the papers and my own thoughts, felt suffocating. I needed air, the noise of people around me, something to shake the feeling of numbness that had settled over me. I grabbed my coat and headed down to the lobby, stepping out into the night. The city was alive, buzzing with the laughter of tourists and the low hum of traffic, and I found myself drawn to a little bar tucked between two bustling restaurants. It was quieter than the places nearby, its neon sign flickering in a way that made it look worn and welcoming. Inside, I found a seat at the bar, ordering a drink without much thought. I took a long sip, letting the burn of the alcohol settle my nerves. The bartender, a tall, quiet guy with kind eyes, didn't pry. He just gave a small nod as he poured, like he understood that I didn't need conversation, just a place to sit and be. Around me, people chatted, their voices blending into a soothing murmur. For a while, I just watched them, letting their laughter and stories wash over me, grounding me in a moment that felt real, untainted by the memories that lingered in the back of my mind. At some point, the bartender refilled my glass and gave me a slight nod. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone casual, not pressing. I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. "You could say that." He gave a small smile, wiping down a glass. "Well, here's to better ones." I raised my glass, nodding. "Here's to that." As I took another sip, I felt a shift in me, a tiny flicker of something I hadn't felt since the whole ordeal began, a glimmer of possibility, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a life beyond this, beyond her. And as I sat there, surrounded by strangers and the low hum of the bar, I felt a tentative hope take root, small but steady, for the first time in what felt like forever. I spent the night at the bar until the city quieted down, trying to let go of everything that had weighed on me all day. Walking back through the empty streets, I replayed the scene by the pool, her face, her shock, and Dylan's dumbfounded splash. It was satisfying, if bittersweet. By the time I reached my hotel, exhaustion had settled in. As I entered, my phone buzzed, showing a string of missed calls, mostly from her but also from my friend Mark. Surprised to see his messages, I read the last one. "Call me ASV. It's important." With a deep breath, I dialed, bracing myself for whatever he needed to tell me. "Alex." Mark's voice was full of concern. He paused before saying, "There's something you need to know. It's about Dylan and your wife." This wasn't the first time, man. It's been going on a lot longer than you think. A chill swept over me. Mark's words confirmed what I'd feared but hadn't let myself believe. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a choice she'd made again and again. I thanked him, his steady loyalty a comfort as he assured me I didn't have to face this alone. After the call, a profound sense of loss washed over me. For the first time, my anger gave way to grief. She'd been building a life in secret, a life that mocked everything we'd built together. I stood by the window, watching the lights of the city blur beneath me. My life as I'd known it was gone, but as the grief settled, it stirred a quiet strength inside me. Her betrayal would not define me. Piece by piece, I'd rebuild, and I knew I'd come out of this hole. The next morning, I lay awake, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling as reality sank in. I'd felt anger, shock, even grief, but none of it had broken me. Instead, a strange resilience had surfaced, something I hadn't realized was there. I noticed the divorce papers on the desk, still unsigned. She must not have realized how serious I was. My phone was filled with missed calls and messages from her, shifting from apologies to accusations. But I ignored them all. I needed space. I wandered the city aimlessly, the cool morning air grounding me. Eventually, I found myself near her hotel, where I saw her through the lobby doors alone, typing on her phone with a worn-out look. She seemed smaller, weighed down, even defeated. For a brief moment, memories of our good years stirred up a pang of something close to pity, but it quickly faded. This was her reality now, a mess of her own making. I took one last look, feeling closure settle over me, and walked away lighter than I had felt in months. Back in my hotel room, I felt the weight of finality. Seeing her alone in the lobby had crystallized everything. She was no longer the person I thought I knew, only someone who'd made choices that couldn't be undone. Just as I settled into the quiet, my phone buzzed with a text. It was Mark, checking in like he had since the night before, his support unwavering. I replied, grateful to have someone in my corner. But then another message appeared, from a number I didn't recognize. I knew immediately who it was. The message was brief, pleading for a final chance to explain. I hesitated, torn between leaving it unread or finally saying my piece. But I realized that if I didn't address it now, she might never understand that there was truly no way back. I called, keeping my voice steady. Her apologies, her claims of being lost, I'd heard it all before. But this time, the words sounded empty. You didn't make a mistake, I told her calmly. You made a choice. Over and over. She tried one last time, her voice breaking, but I cut her off. You already had a chance. You threw it away. With that, I hung up, feeling the finality of it settle around me. For the first time, I was free, ready to leave her and all of this behind. The call left me feeling lighter, as if her words, her betrayal, had finally been purged. The life I'd once imagined, our home, our plans, was gone, leaving a strange, quiet emptiness. But I realized that emptiness was a blank slate, a chance to rebuild. My phone buzzed. It was Mark. Let's grab lunch. On me. Grateful, I agreed, knowing Mark had been there through every high and low. When I arrived, he looked me over and asked, "So, how are you holding up?" "Free," I replied, surprising myself. "It's scary, but honestly, it's exciting too." Mark grinned. "You deserve that. You put everything into the relationship. Now it's your turn to put everything into you." We talked for hours about all the dreams I'd put aside: travel, starting a business, rediscovering my own goals. By the time we left, I felt something new: hope. Mark patted my shoulder. "Whatever you do next, do it for you. You've earned that." As I walked back into the city, the weight of the past lifted, replaced by the steady beat of new possibilities. For the first time in years, I felt ready to find out what came next. This was my clean slate, a life fully my own. In the weeks that followed, each day felt like rediscovering pieces of myself I'd left behind. I reconnected with old friends, picked up neglected hobbies, and allowed myself to dream again. The memories still crept in, but each time, I reminded myself I was building something new, something just for me. One afternoon, flipping through old notebooks, I found an idea from my 20s, opening a coffee shop. The thought reignited a spark, and I began planning in earnest, scouting for locations, sketching ideas, and envisioning every detail. Soon, I'd found a small, sunlit spot on a quiet street and spent weekends painting and designing, shaping it into a place that felt like home. On opening day, people streamed in, and as I served each customer, I felt that I'd truly started anew. Mark came by one evening, and we toasted to new beginnings. Sitting there, I thought back to everything that had brought me here. I'd walked through fire, and somehow, I'd come out stronger. The life I'd imagined before was gone, but in its place, I'd built something that was mine, solid, fulfilling, and real. And for the first time, I felt whole.